Committee called for a general strike for a 6-hour day. Five days a week, 6 hours, 30-hour week. They were working 84 during the war. Before the war started, they were working a 54-hour week, 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, plus Saturday morning. So a 6-hour day was a very radical demand. Now the Clyde Workers Committee was from shop stewards from around the city. They were all socialists. A lot of them were in the Socialist Labor Party, which was heavily influenced by the industrial workers of the world. The IWW in the United States had been promoting a 6-hour day. That was one of their key demands that they saw as transitional towards a future society. They were very clear about that. So it wasn't by accident that the 6-hour day was being promoted by the Clyde Workers Committee. Now here's where it gets a little more complicated. The response was enormous. All kinds of workers were ready to go. And the official Trades Council, the Glasgow Trades Council, understood that and they wanted to channel it. So they called for a joint meeting. And at that joint meeting, they agreed to an 8-hour demand, which is a considerable back off from a 6-hour. But that's what happened. So January 19th, no, let me get my dates right. On January 21st, which was a Monday, the general strike went into effect. And it was for an 8-hour day, 5 days a week. It shut down the city of Glasgow. All the shipyards, all the major factories, they were all empty. The trams were continued to work because they had broken the tram workers union before this. The city council had. So those were going as strike breakers. And there were confrontations around the city when workers would rush up to the trams, block it, rip off the cords that tied it to their electric circuit, and they would be shut down. Okay, so the strike was working, was very effective, and that was Monday. On a Wednesday, that Wednesday, they came here to George Square, and they were going into the city chamber demanding that the Lord Provost, who is a Tory, should communicate to the government, which was primarily Tory as well. Now, again, this has to do with the Glasgow Trades Council. I can't imagine that the Clyde Workers Committee seriously thought that the Tory Lord Provost was going to agree to no, not likely. But anyway, that's what happened. There were thousands of people in George Square that Wednesday, and a delegation went into the city chamber to meet with the Lord Provost, whose name is James Stewart. Interesting, he didn't actually live in Glasgow, even though he was the Lord Provost of Glasgow. He lived in Bearsden. But a small matter. So anyway, he told them to come back that Friday, which I think was a setup. They came back. There was supposed to be something like 60,000 people in George Square. It was perfectly peaceful. The rally took place right here. There was not the cenotaph there, of course, because that was well after World War I. There was a monument of Gladstone. And so people spoke, where, their backs facing to the city chambers. Anyway, a delegation went in, and of course, the Lord Provost was not about ready to agree to an 8-hour day, so he was just putzing around. And a tram came, I believe, on George Square. And you got to imagine, there's 60,000 people. It's filled. The tram went through. Now, the trams had been breaking the strike all along. People were very angry at them to begin with. And that was a real provocation. So the tram was stopped. People surrounded it. They ripped off the electric cord. And at that point, hundreds of cops, many of whom were hidden in the city chambers, came pouring out, started beating. Now, 500 cops sounds like a lot, but there were 60,000 people here. They fought back. So, and there was a lorry carrying lemonade bottles that was having to go through George Square at the same time. They took over the lorry and they started throwing bottles at the cops. The cops actually were forced back into the city chamber, which is often you hear about riots. This was a riot. This was a real riot. Hundreds of cops were forced back. The delegation came out on those steps, and as they came out, they were clubbed by the cops. One of them was clubbed unconscious. The sheriff tried to read the riot act. People ripped it out of his hands. Eventually, the delegation came out and they urged people to calm down a little bit and move off to the Green. And that's what happened. They went to the Green after this. The government, again, was controlled by Tories, used this as an excuse to move 10,000 troops. 10,000. It's a lot of troops for a city. Machine guns, tanks, the whole bit, to occupy the city of Glasgow, which they did, and the strike was broken. Now the Glasgow Trades Council called it off after a few days. The Clyde Workers' Committee finally called it off about 2 weeks after the strike had started. That was one final point. They actually agreed to a 47-hour work week, so the workers did actually win a partial concession. But there's no doubt in terms of the Glasgow radical left, it was a huge defeat because they started firing a lot of activists in shipyards. There was no doubt about it. It was a big defeat. A lot of things to think about what went wrong. Certainly to me, the idea of having a joint thing with the Glasgow Trades Council, big mistake. 6-hour day, that was a real demand that people would get behind, not as an immediate demand, but as looking forward. The other point that John McLean wrote, he wasn't here on that day, but he thought it was premature that they had to go around and organize all around Scotland, and really should have been Northern England as well, where a lot of factories were. So he was actually organizing among the coal miners when they were here in George Square. Anyway, but anybody who tells you that Glasgow was not a radical focus during that period is just dead wrong, because you don't have 60,000 people here. Everybody knew it was a very tense situation. You don't shut down the city for several days in a general strike unless you have a whole lot of support. And everybody knew the Clyde Workers' Committee was controlled by revolutionary socialists. There was no secret about that. So that is indicative of how much support, left-wing politics had at the time. Any questions or comments? I mean, it's good to feel that you're at the spot that it happened.
Well, they locked Scottish soldiers into the barracks up in Maryhill.
Okay, so that's one thing I didn't say. There were Scottish soldiers at Maryhill Barracks. Yeah. And Willie Gallagher, who was one of the leaders of the Clyde Workers' Committee, later wrote that if they would have been truly revolutionaries, they would have marched to the Maryhill Barracks, convinced the Scottish soldiers to go over on their side, and then somehow that would make a revolution. That is a very schematic view of the way revolutions occur. Based on a misreading. It's not enemy country. This is Glasgow, and they treat it as if it was an enemy country, right? And they were quite prepared to use those machine guns if people, came in their way.
Supposedly they were up on the roof, the post office machine guns.
I read that too. They had snipers around. Yeah. They had the whole bit. And speaking of snipers, at this very place, in 2014, when the wars commemorated the 100th year of World War I, they had right here some Royals, and the bigwigs came here. They had this whole area blocked off with barbed wire, with wire, and they had snipers. I remember seeing snipers right over there. So that's not back in 19...
I don't think that was for proletarian revolution.
Yeah, fortunately there were about 100 of us, not 60,000 like there were in 1919. That's the thing. I mean, it's not like to talk about the revolution was around the corner is foolishness. On the other hand, there were a whole lot of radicals in Glasgow at the time. So they being the government and people behind the government, had some reason to fear them and to want to crush them. It was, that was real. If you can shut down the city for several days, you have power. There's no question about it. There was a power they were intent on breaking. Because I think they were deliberately sucked into coming back here on that Friday. No real reason. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that a Tory provost is going to give you it's not going to happen. So they were sitting ducks here, right? And they did it. Okay. Next one is Keith. No, I'm the next one. You're right. You're right. All right, onward.
I know the route plan.
Anarchist social centre come organising place in the late 80s. And that's what you all got to say about it. It's just since we're going past it, and people don't know about these places. So there we go. There'll be plenty of other ones to find out.
How long did it
Was it a spot?
A year or two. No, it wasn't explosion. No,
Like
it was
rented,
rented,
yeah.
We moved on to a place near the Goma after that. So that was the time that Leslie Bolton was involved. The woman who's famously clubbed during the Orgreave by the mounted horse. So she was in Glasgow at the time, and she was one of the people that ran the social centre there. I'm saying the social centre is more an organising base than a social centre.
Can you speak up a wee bit, sorry?
Well, I was just explaining that this is one as a brief stop we've had, and it was a centre that was existed in the late 80s. I'll maybe type up stuff later on for that, because I don't want to detain it too long.
A little bit about the history of why they're important to the history of Glasgow and the wider movement. So we've got that, and an introduction to anarchy, if you haven't already got any insight to that.
Full version.
I'm just looking for, it's by the Anarchist Teapot Collective in Brighton, and I've also got some free leaflets here for anyone that would like to get one about places that you'll be visiting on the walk.
I've got a few of these, but not only for 4 of the things.
Well, there's enough here for probably one for everyone.
Good.
But I can't come on the walk, so if anyone would like to give them out.
Okay, can we start it again? So this is the Sheriff's Court, the old Sheriff's Court. And in 1915, one of the key moments in Glasgow radical history happened right here. It started in that spring, May 1915. The landlords started raising rents. And again, you got to envision during World War I, this city was at over full employment. There were more jobs available than there were people, because they were turning out ships, machine guns, the whole bit for the war. So people streamed into Glasgow, and they were packed. There was not enough housing. So the landlords thought this was a perfect opportunity to raise rents, and they did. And in response, starting in Govan and then in other working class areas around Glasgow, the women started organizing rent strikes. They withheld their rent, and when the sheriff's bailiffs came to evict them, they would set out bells, and everybody would come screaming to them and block their way, block the sheriff's way, and throw flower bombs at the sheriff's bailiffs. So that wasn't working. So they decided to go around that, and what they did is they being the landlords, went to sheriff's court here, and they got orders against the people who were withholding their rent to say that they'll deduct the amount owed from what they're getting paid at the shipyards.
Really?
Yeah, that's why they were here. So that would allow them to collect the rents, the higher rents. So on the day that was going to happen, I think there were about a dozen of them who were facing eviction orders, who were going to get those kind of orders against their pay. November 18th, 1915, about 10,000 people came from marching from Govan and from the other working class areas around here, and they all converged on this building. So you got to envision, just like we were envisioning before, 60,000 people in George Square. This area is covered with about 10,000. So it's not like George Square, they were overflowing into the streets all around. And people started speaking. John McLean was one of them. Willie Gallagher was another. There are other leading activists speaking. Now, I thought it was sort of neat. What they did is, this wasn't all gentrified like it is now. So there were little stores selling newspapers. And they had like those sandwich boards, announcing the news headlines. They ripped up the sandwich board, and then there'd be 6 guys hefty, presumably, that would hold it, and then they would haul the speaker on top of the sandwich board. So I read Willie Gallagher's story. He said it wasn't too stable. He wasn't feeling real safe, but they did it anyway. And so that they didn't have microphones or anything like that. They just bellowed out on top of their sandwich boards. So while that was going on, delegations from different shipyards and the big factories were sent people into the sheriff's court, and each delegation would speak up, and they'd say, well, if you don't back off, if these rents aren't frozen, we're going to go on strike. This is World War I, so this is wartime. Strikes were illegal. And Glasgow was an important center of arms production. That was a serious threat. So the sheriff called up Lloyd George, who was the prime minister at the time, and I got that wrong. He was a minister of munitions at the time. He wasn't prime minister. He was minister of munitions, and they called him and said, look, they're going to go on strike. Your munitions aren't going to get produced if these rent increases go through. And Lloyd George backed off. And they froze the rents for the rest of the war. So that one was a big victory. And it all happened here at the sheriff's court. Well, it started happening in Govan and all the neighborhoods with the women organs. The final thing was here. So that was, I think that sense that direct action, and again, this was massive direct action. Thousands of people going on rent strike, plus 10,000 people in these narrow streets, could win. And that was part of what fueled the general strike in January 1919, that same belief. The difference, of course, was it was no longer wartime, so they were ready to take on the working class of Glasgow. They weren't in 1915. Questions about that?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to hear more, if it's not too much, about the collusion between landlords and the employers to take the rents out of their pay packets. That's really dystopian.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the argument was that you weren't meeting your contractual obligations. You weren't paying your rent. Thus, you go into court and have the contract enforced. Now, the only way you can enforce it is people didn't have any savings in the bank. You couldn't seize their savings. They didn't have cars or anything. They had nothing, frankly. They weren't getting paid a whole lot. So another way you could actually collect was from their pay. I mean, it made perfect sense.
Yeah.
If you're assuming the assumptions, that the landlord has the power. It made sense what they were doing. It's just and it would have happened. No question, it would have happened had 10,000 people not showed up and had those delegations not gone in and said, if you pursue this path, we're going to go out and strike. That was a serious threat. I mean, they would have occupied Glasgow in the middle, and they weren't too eager to send troops from the Western Front to Glasgow. They were having enough problems with the Germans as it was. They weren't looking for so that was an effective threat, and the fact that 10,000 people had showed up made the threat credible, right? They had shown the power to do just that. Because all those 10,000 people, they were missing work. 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, you were working. So if you came here, you were on strike. And they came here, nonetheless. It was illegal. Technically, they could have been charged with violating the Defense of the Realm Act. It carried heavy penalties. There was actually one of the regulations under the DORA regulations, internal exile. And this actually happened to some of the strike leaders. They were told they had to leave Glasgow and move elsewhere. Yeah, and there was no court proceeding. The Army had the power to do that.
Wow.
Yeah. There was not a lot of democracy in Britain during World War I. You look at the Defense of the Realm regulations; they are extreme. They're very, very strict. So all this was very iffy to do. It was not a simple act to do, and they did it anyway, and the government backed down. And when it came down to it, they didn't want to. The fight wasn't. There was one fight they were not looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, just a follow-up question. Did the ship companies own the housing then? Was it company housing?
They did. They would not entirely, but a lot of it had been built by large employers, right? But not only, and probably the ones who would have been enforcing it would not have been the shipyards. Obviously, they didn't want their workers to go on strike, right? So, yeah. So it was a mixture. But it's true, a lot of housing that was built, particularly along the Clyde, was built by the shipyard owners for their workforce, because that area out there was rural. There was nothing there before the shipyards, you know. So these were completely artificially created communities. The corporation decided to build a big shipyard, then they decided to build the housing that went along with it, then they built railroads so that people could get in and out. You know, it was completely designed, planned. You know. I was thinking about this because I always think about socialism and planning, but the fact is, under capitalism, there's lots of planning going on. It's just being planned by large corporations instead of by people, and that's a good example. So they just decided they couldn't build big shipyards further down the Clyde. They needed to go further out, and they just created whole communities that way.
Clyde Bank.
Clyde Bank being a good example of them, right?
Because my grandfather was in a tied house, John Brown's.
Yeah, John Brown's. Yeah. So anyway, but it wasn't. You know, there was also private housing as well. So yeah.
Still more of the rent strike leaflets.
Okay.
I could mention too that Jean Ferguson, one of the lesser known rent strike leaders, she was an anarchist whose partner was involved in the Clyde Workers' Committee. She's just one of these people you tend to focus on, Mary Barber and the other leaders, but there were other people who played pivotal roles at the time.
Yeah, I didn't talk about Mary Barber. She was one of the leaders in Govan where it started, and her husband worked in one of the shipyards. So there was like that's what's so different now. In a place like Govan, everything happened around the shipyard. So people, they were living with their workmates, and it's one unified community now. That's no longer the case. But anyway, she was in the Independent Labour Party. I talked about the Socialist Labour Party before. The Independent Labour Party was a more moderate socialist group. It was part of the Labour Party, which supported the war. But the Independent Labour Party did not support the war. So Mary Barber was one of the leaders in Govan. But yeah, there were a lot of women activists who were key in organizing that. They just focused on her because she later became a Glasgow City's council member. There are pictures of her all dressed up official. Yeah, so it makes it seem more, mainstream. But in fact, there was a whole group of people doing this, a whole group of women doing this, and it wasn't just in Govan. It came spread out throughout the area. Okay. You gonna take over, Keith?
There's a very short hop to the next one in Brunswick St over there. So. So the next couple of stops are primarily to do with the anarchist movement, wider libertarian socialist movement in Glasgow. First of all, the reason we're in Brunswick Street is that it was one of the main places the Anarchist Federation of Britain had public meetings during the Second World War. Obviously, Argyle Street just down there, that wasn't all blocked off. There was a couple of pubs there. One at the time was called the Hangman's Rest, and that was where the anarchists had a wee drink now and again. They had a small room as well in Brunswick Street, having moved from George Street, where we're about to head off later on. So these meetings were really anti-war, they were anti-capitalist, there was prominent speakers who held a crowd, was principally Eddie Shaw, Frank Rayside. They were the main speakers, but there was other people got up to too. But they faced a lot of opposition. As soon as they got up on a pedestal, patriotic elements would try and kick away the pedestal and create trouble. They had to be able to, defend themselves, and it was during wartime. It was a difficult time. A lot of them had been conscientious objectors. They were directly helping and assisting people on the run from the military, deserters. They put people up in flats. There was people staying in bothies in the Highlands or whatever. So I learnt a lot of this from Molly and Charlie Baird, who were around in the 70s. Their son was involved in the anarchist movement in the 70s, and I met them, and Charlie Baird had become the secretary of the Anarchist Federation of Britain, Glasgow, around about 1942. He'd been, like a lot of people, he'd been imprisoned for refusing to fight, and he didn't have a reserved occupation, which some other anti-parliamentarians did, so basically information was passed on orally to us, but we also did interviews, and in 1987 there was a meeting of the Free University, the very first meeting of the Free University, and the Raysides were over from Perth, Australia, where they'd actually settled in 1953, and the Bairds were there, and also John Taylor Caldwell, who obviously is a crucial person in terms of history of the revolutionary movement. So we had that meeting. It's all audio. It's all on audio via Radical Glasgow, and you can also see a transcript of it as well. So that documented a lot of the things they did. They did tend to dwell a bit about splits and divisions. I don't know why people do that, but it did happen. I think what tended to happen is the AFB in Glasgow was linked to the scene in London, and people in London like to deal with certain key people in the group, notably Frank Leach, Eddie Shaw and Jimmy Rayside. I said Frank Rayside earlier, it was Jimmy Rayside. So Frank Leach is a very interesting person. He was disappeared from being a member of the Anti-Parliamentary Communist Federation for many years, and then he resurfaced when the Spanish Civil War was going on, rejoined them, but he was a divisive figure. The guy was a boxer. He in the meantime he'd gone on and basically become a small businessman, had opened two news agents, and even ran a car, which was unheard of, because it was a time when most of the anarchists were really living on the breadline. They couldn't get proper jobs. They were basically, most of them were living hand to mouth, and Frank Leach was a character different from the rest. But anyway, he went on to create the Anarchist Communist Federation, and which transformed into the AFB. So, but this was the site anyway for these street meetings. That was the important thing. There was a lot of people gathered round. If you look around here, you'll see a picture of Jimmy Dick, one of the spokespersons in Brunswick Street. But you also see crowds in Maxwell Street and also outside factories in Dalmuir, because they were taking on the Communist Party at the time. It was actually colluding with the government war effort, because they changed their policy completely, after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So basically, the anarchists were a focal point of opposition to encourage workers in strike, and they actually made links with strikers in the bus workers in 1941, and with the Bar and Stroud women workers in 1943. And the solidarity there was expressed in 1943 too, when Frank Leach was charged with not reporting for duty as a reserve fire person or something, and he went on hunger strike for 17 days, and they clubbed together. He didn't really want his fine paid, but anyway they paid his fine, and they contributed. So there was a sure solidarity. It was going on underneath the surface. So I can pass that around if people want to have a wee look at it. That's a cutting from War Commentary, which was what Freedom was during the war. It became a fortnightly publication that was distributed by the AFB. Obviously, at the time, we'll cover Aldred in the next trip, but basically they were bringing out the Word, which is a different publication entirely. So, unless there's any questions, we can move on. By the way, have you given out the ones on? Yeah, I didn't really touch on Willie McDougall, because there's all this stuff written about Willie McDougall, but he was had been a founder member of the Anti-Panties, as they call them, the Anti-Parliamentary Communist Federation in 1922. His old man ran a printing press and actually produced all sorts of community papers up in the Highlands and Islands. But he actually took over that. But he was quite a pivotal figure, but he wasn't a street speaker in the normal sense. He was accused of hearing both sides of the argument. He was too balanced, too dialectical in his reasoning. He wasn't as dogmatic as the others. So basically, he was an interesting figure. He also went on to create the Workers' Open Forum, which was a debating area for anarchists and libertarian socialists that healed a lot of the divisions anyway that went on to the 40s into the 50s. We'll move on to George Street, but we're going to go up via Montrose Street and just go straight up this one here. The Strickland Press moved to the end of their time in Montrose Street. It's not actually this old building, it's really here, which is supplanted where the old buildings used to be. So I think it was in the 50s and 60s they couldn't afford to maintain George Street any longer, so they moved to here. So we're just stopping here briefly and moving on. The main one is around the corner. Quite probably noisy, I think. Basically, this is the site of 104 to 106 George Street, and this was the place that the United Socialist Movement, which was the name of the Guy Aldridge organisation, purchased. They got these two properties as a result of inheriting a large bequest. The time has got to be explained. They were really, really destitute as a group. I mean, Caldwell recalls, for example, he never ate on a Thursday. Things were they were so poor. They didn't have enough money to send Ethel MacDonald and Jenny Patrick any further in London. It was a London comrades that raised money for them to get to France. There just wasn't the funds. So basically, in 1938, late 1937, he got a communication, Aldred, from this guy Walter Strickland, who was a maverick anti-war capitalist, basically. And he tried to employ Aldred away back in 1909 as his personal secretary. Aldred refused, went on to create the Herald of Revolt and various other papers after that, the Spur. Aldred settled in Glasgow in 1922, leaving his partner Rose Whitcomb, etc., and shacking up with Jenny Patrick instead. So basically, he got involved in the Anti-Parliamentary Communist Federation. So this guy Strickland, for a number of years, he'd kept on sending £25 as donations. But he obviously knew his time was at the end. He didn't want to give all his money to his adopted children. So he arranged to send a bequest to the United Socialist Movement via Aldred. Aldred got 3,500, and there was another 2,000 or so came from unregistered sources. So they were awash with funds. But so they went out, they created this press. They had to completely rewire the place, refurnish it, and they brought presses in from Wishaw. The presses were so old, I think they'd been made in 1851. Despite the money, they didn't go that far, So basically, it was the quartet, the hub of the USM, who worked here. Aldred, Ethel MacDonald back from Spain, she did a hell of a lot of the work, typing, etc. Jenny Patrick and John Taylor Caldwell, he was a young one at the time, So they created a Strickland Press, and they published all sorts of pamphlets. The print run was about 5,000 per issue. It went up to 10,000, 20,000 in the case of John McLean, and believe it or not, The Truth About Pearl Harbor. That was the other big seller, which is not one you normally see in anarchist libraries, but it was a big seller at the time. So the main thing they published was the Word. They printed the Word, but mostly they didn't typeset it because it was just too technical for them to do. They had to contract that out. The Words ran from 19... Well, there was a first edition of the Word which was produced in a sort of small edition in the Press and Govern. But the proper editions were from May 1939 onwards, and they went up to 16,000 copies an issue. But they started to tail off quite a bit by the mid-50s, into by 1963 when Alder died. There was circulation was down considerably. So United Socialist Movement was created by Alder. He wanted to make a bridgehead into the ILP, and it never quite happened. Some of the Townhead branch joined, but he never created a large group. A lot of people are critical about Alder. He was a charismatic figure, but a lot of people didn't like the way everything was organised around him. He was a lot of his people in the group were seen as followers. People were devoted followers. For example, Anne Haining or William McClure, and there was an artist whose name just escapes me, Jane Patch, who designed all the letterhead and the banners and whatever. So if you look at the book with Fate Conspire, you'll see a lot of these people in photographs. I've got a copy and I can hand it around when we have the long march to the next the next place. But they were involved in those conscription league as well. So and they went on in the 50s to create study circles and things. They tried to keep going and made links with new anarchists at the time, like Robert Lynn or Parker McClay or Ben Mullen. All these people that kept the USM going in the 60s. Eventually it all folded in May 68. I think it was the last one. The Glasgow Herald's got a press cutting of that, and but it would become a quarterly by then, and the print run was very small. Basically there was a new generation of anarchists and liberty and socialists. There's a lot of things about that group you could ask questions about, probably. At the moment that's all I can remember off the top of my head. Any more? Basically there were three groups in the late 70s, late 30s, but become really two groups effectively in the early 40s. Oh, that's 104 George Street. 127 George Street is somewhere there. I remember when I went to Strathmore Uni in the 70s, there was a Maoist bookshop, anti-imperialist Solidarity in front, and they had a wee shop there. I just wondered if it was the same address, 127, as the anarchists might have had in 1939-40. They only had that place for 2 years. They had a poster in the window about opposition to conscription, and 4 of them were prosecuted, and it looked as if they might face a jail sentence, but the sheriff thought the evidence was flimsy and just dismissed the case. So they had a wee victory there, but they couldn't keep that shop on. And so as I mentioned, when we went to Brunswick St, they moved to a smaller premises there. So just a minute stop, we'll head down here. Just a brief mini stop here. This is one of the many pubs that Robert Lynn used to frequent. He used to produce pamphlets in the 80s called A Rabbit Between the Workers. It was a kind of fictional account of workers talking about things. He used to live in that house with there's now got a mural at the end with a pink.
Who are you talking about?
Robert Lynn. Bobby Lynn is well known. He was involved in the apprentices strike in the early 50s, and he continued involvement right up to the 80s basically. He worked in Howden's engineering, but he was he used to sell all sorts of new trinkets and things around the Queen Street. He did other nefarious activities too. He was a very Jekyll and Hyde character. I'm not the kind of character you see in modern anarchist at all. But nevertheless, I mean, we used to synthesise, like Eddie Shaw before him, Max Stirner, and syndicalism. He was a member of the Syndicalist Workers' Federation. He also helped us put on various social events because there's so many connections with pubs. The Class War Federation had a conference and social, Bobby Lynn arranged that. The IWW, it wasn't the IWW, but there was a meeting about the IWW held at a pub over there. Again, Bobby Lynn organised that. So the man with connections, we won't go into too much. I think he's mentioned in the Struggle Media. So I don't have this chapter in Radical Glasgow, but look online and you'll learn more about Robert Lynn.
How long ago was that case?
Robert Lynn, I think he died in about 1990. His funeral was out in near Mount Vernon. It was a huge turnout. We had a coach to go out there and we're all dressed in black. It was like the... Yeah. And just by coincidence, a leading BBC personality who was having his funeral immediately after that. And only the lovely W's outside were assembled for that. And we all strolled out in our suits and all the rest of it. Absolutely Dobson. Anarchist flag. Anyway, that was... The New Monaco Bar. It was just one of these pubs I mentioned that Robert Lynn knew about. It must have been the late 80s after the anti-poll tax thing. Basically, it was a debate arranged between Militant and the Anarchists. I think about 3 members of Militant turned up and about 30 odd Anarchists. So that's all that happened here. It was a debate. It was all very comradely. There was no problems.
Bobby Sheridan coming up talking.
No, he didn't come along. It was somebody else, I can't remember his name now. Alan McCombs probably.
Oh, McCombs,
yeah. That's as far as that's it. William Godwin and stuff like that, when it was published, they were ahead of their times. They weren't just people who were tradespersons. We'll go inside though, but there's more stuff about the memorial. Going inside, since it's open, it's open. This place used to be owned by a landowner called Walkinshaw. He owned the whole of the Carlton, but he backed the wrong side in the, let's see which one was it, the Jacobite uprising of 1715, and he totally lost all his wealth. So the council, I think, brought it over, and basically there was already Glasgow weaving going on, but there was Carlton weaving and other trades started up here. They were in competition to Glasgow, but in all the weaving places, Paisley, Carlton and Glasgow, they all actually, these workers were receptive to new ideas. They weren't just people who accepted their station. I'm just watching where I stand. So I already mentioned they did read enlightened thinkers like Thomas Paine and William Godwin. And they were quite supportive, obviously, of the American and French revolutions. But in 1787, the employers tried to reduce wages, and they came out in strike. And their annual pay at the time per year was around about £100, which was a lot more than a lot of other people worked. But obviously, the employers were trying to drive the wages down. So they came out in strike, and during the summer they marched throughout Glasgow to protest this 25% wage cut and being locked out. And as the strike kind of got more intense, there were some people trying through desperation, starvation, they were trying to work on, and so they had to seize their looms and basically destroy them. They didn't harm the people, but they destroyed their means because they were essentially scabbing on them. On the 3rd of September, the city magistrates' forces were driven back by an angry mob of weavers, and a detachment from the 39th Regiment under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Kellett engaged in a pitched battle with some of the weavers at Drygate, which I suppose is just up there, just round where Drygate Brewery is, just at the end of Duke Street. 3 were killed instantly, and the other 3 were so badly wounded that they died later. Of the 6, we only know 3 of them. James Page, James Ainsley and Alexander Miller. There was a lot of arrests made. Some flee the country. But they tried to make an example of James Granger, who had a family of 6. He was 38 at the time. He was singled out as a ringleader. He was taken to Edinburgh, paraded through the streets and whipped in public, and he was deported for 7 years. It didn't diminish his spirit, because he was back for the 1812 strike, where they carried on for 3 months. So they had tremendous spirit. So this was a time during the Napoleonic War where the authorities were trying to clamp down on all dissent, and basically people like Thomas Muir and other radicals, they were transported to Botany Bay. The uprising in Trinidad in 1798 was brutally put down. The employers were moved into mechanisation and developing the forces of production. In Glasgow especially, and Paisley, a lot of the wool weaving practices continued on, and we still celebrate Small Shop Day by going over there, and that carried on till 1856. But in Glasgow, getting back to 1812, 7 of the strikers were charged with illegal combination and served 18 months in prison. Strikes and trade unions had been made illegal under the war provisions and continued on till 1824. But the Glasgow tradition of rebellion continued right up through food riots. There was actually food riots in 1800, and also riots broke out in 1848. Right along the Trongate, inspired by Chartism at the time. They didn't just take food, they also ransacked gun shops, and it took them several days to quell. They had to bring a detachment of troops from Edinburgh to quell the uprising. 5 of the crowd were hit by fire ordered by a captain by the name of Smart. And if you go to the People's Palace, you can see Ken Curry, who was an artist at the art school at the time of people like Stacia. But, he depicts the weavers in one of 3 panels, and recording that 6,000 people attended the funerals of the 6 who died. So they're still remembered today. The Carlton Weavers are also known for the song Nancy Whiskey, but that's really about the perils of whiskey drinking. So that's all I've got to say about the Carlton Weavers.
Glasgow Green, I was going to say a little bit about the Green, and then maybe a little bit about John McClain, because we've been talking about him, and then May Day 1918. So the Green actually comes from the 1500s. We're standing in a park that's been around for more than 500 years. It was mostly swamp at the time. There would be a few little hillocks distributed. It was mostly swamp. And the women would come and wash their clothes in the Clyde and then dry them. Those few days it wasn't raining. So the first demonstration I saw mentioned in the Green was about the Carlton Weavers that Keith was just talking about. In 1787, they held a protest demonstration in the Green to support the Carlton Weavers. So this has been used for protests for, 225 years? A long time. In 1816, there was a big demonstration against the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws created tariffs on corn and grain produced elsewhere and made bread more expensive. Working class people basically lived on it. So there were protests against that. 1832, they had a huge demonstration for the Chartists, which was for universal male suffrage. Women were, that wasn't even, that was too far out to even think about. But the radicals were calling for universal male suffrage, and they had a huge demonstration here. 1870s, they started demonstrating for women's suffrage. And then in 1914, in August 1914, a few days after the war was declared, John McClain held the first anti-war rally. It's like 5 days after the war had started, right here, the Nelson Monument. So we're standing where the first demonstration against the World War I took place, and John McClain spoke at it. So I'm just going to say a few words about John McClain, because some of you may not know much about him. He was a teacher. He taught in primary school, actually. And he was a troublemaker. He was active in the British Socialist Party. He used to give classes in Marxist economics. A lot of the people that became leaders of the Clyde Workers' Committee took classes from John McClain about Marxist economics. I still sort of bend my mind around that. What a different kind of period it was. But he was really widely respected even before World War I because of those classes. And I was talking about the demonstrations at the Sheriff's Court. When they marched in from Govan to go to the Sheriff's Court around the rent strikes, they went past his school. He came out and joined the demonstrators. That was the last day he taught in that school. He was in the process of being fired even before then, but after that they said, "You're gone." Okay, so then we're going to talk about May Day 1918. Now, May Day has been celebrated in Glasgow since 1891, but the Glasgow Trades Council insisted it be celebrated the Sunday after May Day. The whole idea originally of May Day was that workers would come out of work, it would be working class solidarity, and you'd show your solidarity by not working. So they missed that, and they held it the Sunday after. We're still doing that. The next Sunday we're going to have the Glasgow Trades Council May Day March. But the 1918, the war was so unpopular that the May Day Committee, heavily influenced by the Clyde Workers' Committee, called for May Day to be on May Day, which was a Wednesday, a work day. And 100,000 people came to the Green, in part as a working class solidarity event, but in part to protest the war. And again, that meant that during wartime they were on strike. It was totally illegal. But they did it, and they came out, 100,000 of them. They had 22 platforms. But that, in those days, when they had a big demonstration, instead of fighting about who was going to speak or having endless speakers, said, all right, you go over there, you go over there, you go over there. And everybody chose. You want to hear John McClain? He was on one platform, some moderate social democrat would be on another, I should say John McClain was not at May Day in 1918, even though he pushed hard for it to be celebrated on May Day, because he was in jail for speaking out against the war. So anyway, they had 22 platforms here, all kinds of different political perspectives, anarchists, you name it, leaflets. And when they got done here, they marched to the Duke Street prison. Duke Street prison is now torn down, but it's at Duke Street and High. John McClain was being held there. They marched. Thousands of them marched from here to the Duke Street prison, and they stood outside of the prison and they sang songs to John McClain. So, that was a great event. We should do more of that. That's why we had May Day on May Day. We're going to do that next year.
Prison, we all sing songs
There were free speech fights here after the 1918, and the city council is still trying to restrict what you can do in the Green. We should protect that right. That's an important right in Glasgow working class history. This place has been used for protests, I'd say, for over 200 years, and it should continue to be that case. It shouldn't be used for commercial venues. It should be used for people. All right, any questions or comments? It's been a good march. Yeah?
Thank you.
And we'll do it again.
We'll do a mini stop before we leave, but if we're going to go that way, then maybe we should just say it now. In the early 1990s, the Workers' City group decided to try and bring the spirit of May Day back. And at the time we were still having the May Day in the Glasgow Green, so it was better than it is now, but so So we had our own free speech platform. All sorts of people got up and spoke, and there was music, and there's some video of it, but it's very shaky. But it carried on for a couple of years, and it was a pretty good event. That's all I recollect.
When was that?
I think it was mostly held in the entrance over there. But
when? What years?
It's around about 1991, 92, 93, around about then. Okay.
I was out of town then.
We'll do it again.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Thank you very much.
We don't do it in the winter this time.
It's Scottish summer.
No guarantees the Glasgow weather. I don't know what the weather was on May Day in 1918. It was probably not real good then either.